welcome everybody. So happy to see our regulars and our visitors from that are associated with Hillel and Temple Beth Tikva. We are so happy to have you here. I'm in Detroit with my father, and having a very nice visit. Hopefully, he will be on this call also, or maybe he already is. I just want to say thank you, and thank you to everybody. We hope you'll take all 8 or 9 sessions. I've given Daniel an extra week if he'd like. This is an opportunity for him to pilot a course that he's going to be teaching at UCI in the spring. And it's, for those of you who follow Daniel like I do, we recognize what a master teacher he is. And this opportunity is made possible through your generosity. So for those of you who have already been able to support the Advanced Learning Institute in whatever way makes sense for you, we are grateful. We pay Daniel every week, and that comes from you. So if you haven't yet been able to make a donation, you are welcome to do so at any time. I'll put the link in the chat, and it will make a great difference. But Daniel's going to teach regardless, and of course, you're always welcome. Daniel, take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And like Ramersha said, this is sort of an experiment. I'm teaching a new class next year at UC Irvine on modern Jewish thought. And so this is an opportunity to both, experiment with some ideas, figure out, what things are interesting, what things aren't. Happy to have this be as interactive as possible because that is all the more fun. The first session, we titled it, "When Do Jews Enter Modernity?" which seems like one of those very dry, boring academic questions. And I want to try to make the argument why this question actually speaks to the essence of a lot of themes that we are going to hit. Clearly, something happens between the year, let's just pick an easy one, between the year 1900 and the year 1600. If you dropped into a time machine into any Jewish community in the year 1600, it would be pretty obvious that we were not yet in modernity. What does that mean? The typical practice of Judaism would be standard, traditional. You would still have a lot of medieval and ancient ideas about how the world works. This is pre-Darwinian evolution. This is pre any type of ideas that challenge the hegemony of various religions. This would be before Jews can dream to have any type of political equality in any country. So any Jewish community you drop into in the year 1600, Jews would not have been seen as equal citizens, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as this class develops. And then fast forward to the year 1900, and it's not that in the year 1900, everything is great and Jews live happily ever after. We know that's obviously not the case. But the material reality and intellectual reality for Judaism is already changed by 1900. There's a variety of Jewish denominations, including Reform, Conservative, soon to be Reconstructionist in the 1920s, Orthodox, Hasidic movement. There's a Jewish nationalist movement, Zionism, that is gaining support on an international Jewish level. Jews had been granted some amount of emancipation in most countries, albeit tenuous, and we, of course, know what happened in Western Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And so something between those time periods change. And this is one of the things that scholars really like to develop, is this question and debate, when do Jews enter modernity? And I'm going to throw us in a little bit in the deep end. I like, in one of my teaching reviews for last class, one of the students said, I really appreciated how every single class we were thrown into the deep end, and then by the end of class, we were somewhat able to make sense of the first couple of minutes. So I'm going to try that again. And we'll pause for questions along the way. And I wanted to start off with my new favorite theory of Jewish modernity. And we're going to kind of talk about 3 major theories of Jewish modernity. And this first one comes from Gershom Scholem, who, for those that are familiar, Gershom Scholem was a 20th century scholar. He is a scholar that quite literally started the field of research into Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. The very fact that most of us sitting here have heard of Kabbalah and have heard of the Zohar and have heard of things like Isaac Luria and the centrality of, say, even ideas like Tikkun Olam, can probably, much of it can be put on Sholem's shoulders. And Gershom Scholem has a radical theory of when Jews enter modernity, and it has to do with the arrival of the Messiah. So for those that didn't know, in the year 1665, the Messiah came. He was revealed in the land of Israel. Of course, I say this flippantly and jokingly, but in the year 1665, this was a major inflection point for Jewish modernity. And the reason why I'm going to guess some people here hadn't heard of it is because over the next 350 years of Jewish history, until modernity, Sholem argues that there has been a systematic attempt to try to downplay the effects of what happened in the mid-17th century. And I'll get to that in a minute. But a man named Shabtai Tzvi was born in 1626 in Turkey. He soon, in his teenage years and his 20s, wandered around the Middle East, eventually landing in the land of Israel, and he ended up making his way down south to Gaza. Gaza in the 1600s was a stronghold of both Jewish learning and Kabbalah, the two major centers, by the way, of Jewish learning and Jewish mysticism in the land of Israel in the 1600s was in the north in Tzfat, which I'm sure people are familiar with, and in the south in Gaza. And this is at a time of Jewish history in the mid-17th century where the ideas of Isaac Luria had already spread throughout the Jewish world. Now we have to take one step back. One of the difficulties of teaching modern Jewish history is that oftentimes modern Jewish writers write as if they assume everybody knows everything that happened before. So I'm going to attempt to, it's going to be one of those movies where we're going to talk about 16, 17, 1800s, and then I'll have flashbacks to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, probably the most successful Jewish cultural and intellectual area took place in Spain. And I've been fortunate enough to teach, several classes here talking about the Jews of Spain. This is where people like Moses Maimonides and Judah Halevi and Moses de Leon, the author of the Zohar, lived. And so, albeit, the statement probably can use a little bit more nuance, life was generally good for the Jews of Spain. And all of a sudden in the 13 and 1400s, with the Spanish Christian Reconquista, Jews are eventually expelled from Spain in 1492. Then 5 years later, Jews are expelled from Portugal in 1497. And the vast majority of those Jews end up moving to the wider Middle East. It's why today there's still confusion about Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. Sephardi Jews, Jews of Spain and Portugal. Mizrahi Jews, Jews of the Middle East. And in the 15 and 1600s, those two communities basically fused together historically. And Isaac Luria was sort of one of the leaders of the Jewish people in the 1500s. He is the reason why we all know of the town of Tzfat. You can thank him for anybody here who appreciates things like Kabbalat Shabbat and the prayer Lecha Dodi. We can thank Isaac Luria, otherwise known as the Arizal, for that. And Isaac Luria put forth this radical idea of exile. And what Isaac Luria taught is for the previous 1500 years since the destruction of the temple, Jews had seen exile as something bad, right? It is bad that Jews are spread out throughout the world. It is bad that we are not in the land of Israel. And we, of course, one day hope to return to the land of Israel, rebuild the temple, enter Messianic times, right? Your average Jew in the medieval or ancient period would have said that exile is always bad, right? We have to do whatever we can to get out of the exile. When Isaac Luria started teaching in this school of Tzfat, which is why it was such a important inflection point and why on every trip to Israel you have to go visit, the fascinating city of Tzfat, is Isaac Luria said, what if there's actually empowerment to be had through the exile? And Isaac Luria taught this cosmology of the world where in order to create the world, God had to mitzamtzem, God had to pull back from the world. And so if you imagine God as being all-encompassing and infinite, in order for an infinite God to create something finite, say the universe, or say even us having free will, Luria taught that God had to pull back from the world. But when that happened, according to Luria, something terrible happened, and darkness entered the world because God was removing himself. And all that we're left with in this world are just scatterings of light that are around the world, but they're not together, right? This world is still one of darkness, right? You look around, things are bad, there's suffering in the world, and our world is definitely not complete. Our world has a lot of darkness, our world has a lot of brokenness. And he says that it's the job of the Jewish people to go around lifting up these sparks of light from any place that you can find them. And so what Isaac Luria began to teach in the school in Tzfat in the 15 and 1600s is that there's actually redemption to be had through the exile. That don't think that Jews living, be it Poland, be it Hungary, be it Iran, Iraq, be it Turkey, that this isn't some accident of history and we're just, crossing off the days until we can return to the land of Israel, that every single person in the Jewish community has a unique mission to fulfill through their part of exile. And with this, a new ideology of Judaism known as Lurianic Kabbalah started to spread. And people all across the Jewish world began to buy into this idea of we are spread around to collect these sparks because the Messianic age is imminent, right? All we need is a couple of more mitzvot, a couple more commandments, And then all of a sudden, we're going to have redemption. And so the 15 and 1600s, as Europe is undergoing major changes in terms of geography, in terms of politics, this is also when the advent of the printing press is born, so ideas are able to spread much faster. This idea of Lurianic Kabbalah and Messianism starts proliferating throughout the Jewish world, which then leads us to Shabtai Tzvi and his partner Nathan of Gaza. And what Shabtai Tzvi begins to teach is, he says, and this is a radical formulation, and here's why, in a minute, you'll see why Sholem uses this to begin his idea of Jewish modernity. If sparks are in exile, which is unholy, Shabtai Tzvi taught, then sparks must be everywhere, even in the world of sin. And so counterintuitively, Shabtai Tzvi levies this idea of messianism, and he levies it against the entirety of the rabbinic tradition. And Shabtai Tzvi starts to teach, well, if God is everywhere, and redemption is everywhere, and even if exile is a place where you can find holiness, then why is there a difference between something that is considered a mitzvah and something that's considered an avera? There should be just as many sparks of godliness in a cheeseburger as there is in a piece of gefilte fish. He didn't literally say that, but right, we can imagine this formulation. And Shabtai Tzvi continues, and he says, well, the reason why the Messianic age has been delayed is because these sparks in the unholy world, the world of darkness, the world of later Hasidic teachers will formulate a theory of klipot, the world of the shells. These sparks are still waiting to be redeemed. And so Shabtai Tzvi comes up with this formulation of, you have to bring about the redemption by subverting tradition. Now, this formulation seems crazy to us, right? I'm going to grant that. But this captivated about 30 to 40% of the Jewish world who believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah. It quickly spread throughout the Sephardic world, all throughout Turkey, all throughout the land of Israel. It soon entered into the Ashkenazi world by way of Eastern Europe. And so hundreds of thousands of Eastern European Jews started to hail Shabtai Tzvi as the new Messiah. And Shabtai Tzvi, right, the end of his story is well known, and then I'll get into the theory of why this is a interesting argument for Jewish modernity. At the end of the day, Shabtai Tzvi, after hailing himself the Messiah, decides that he is going to march into the Ottoman Sultan's office or palace in Turkey and proclaim that the Messiah is here, right? The Ottoman Empire, the Sultan can, pack up and he can leave because we are going to reclaim Israel. And of course, the Sultan did not say yes. Surprisingly, he imprisoned Shabtai Tzvi for a couple of weeks. And when Shabtai Tzvi finally emerged, it had been clear to everybody that Shabtai Tzvi had converted to Islam. Now, this, of course, resulted in the vast majority of his followers realizing their embarrassment and their shame and trying to sweep the whole episode under the rug, and a much smaller but still sizable percentage of Jews that still held on to this belief and said Shabtai Tzvi has just entered into a deeper realm of unholiness, right? The realm of non-Jewishness. Why is this interesting and important? Because for Sholem, this was the inflection point of Jewish modernity for two reasons. And these are two themes that we're going to come back to time and time again. One, the centrality and authority of the rabbis. Right, for Sholem and for many of pre-modern, think the Talmud, medieval, the centrality of the Jewish community, the rabbis and the rabbinic tradition. All things were tradition. If you had a question, there was only one person to ask your question to, a rabbi who was well studied in the Talmudic tradition. And again, everything revolved around the from now, but at the end of the day, there was one type of Jewish authority. It was the rabbis. With Shabtai Tzvi proclaimed himself antinomian, right? What that generally means is Shabtai Tzvi started saying the rabbis might actually be holding us back from redemption. There's actually a conservative element in Jewish law, which is what Shabtai Tzvi was insinuating. And that conservative element is actually keeping Jews from entering into the Messianic era. And so Jews have to unleash the shackles of Jewish law in order to enter into modernity in the Messianic age, right? This is one half of it. The second half is the idea that Jews are sick and tired of waiting around for the Messiah, right? This, for Sholem, was the second major inflection point of what creates Jewish modernity, where you drop into your average medieval Jewish community. It doesn't make a difference if this is a Sephardic or Ashkenazi or Mizrahi medieval Jewish community. And everybody's general disposition towards the Messiah or Mashiach was, of course, we believe in perfect faith that Mashiach might come. When? Well, we can guess, but it's not really up to us to figure out the exact date. If he comes tomorrow, great. If he comes in 5 years, great. And if he comes in 500 years, that's also great, right? We are content in our faith of waiting for the Messiah, right? As Maimonides says in his 13 Principles of Faith, even if he might tarry, even if he takes a while, I believe in perfect faith that he will come. For Sholem, what happened in the 1600s with Shabtai Tzvi isn't just an isolated incident of one man who was charlatan-like that was able to convince major swaths of the Jewish world that the Messiah had come. For Sholem, this inflection point highlighted the fact that the Jews are tired of waiting, that no longer do Jews want to be told, okay, we can see that your material and maybe even spiritual condition is very low, right? Jews have no power, Jews have no rights, but just wait and have faith a little bit longer. For Sholem, the 1600s is when there is a clear inflection point, and for a large percentage of Jews, and that percentage of Jews, Sholem argues, continues to grow generation after generation, Jews are saying, enough of this, we are done waiting around for the Messiah. We need to usher in the Messianic age ourselves, whether that be through the traditional guise of thinking somebody like Shabtai Tzvi or Jacob Frank or one of the Hasidic rabbis are actually the Messiah, or in the realm of secular, be it we're tired of waiting around for a Messiah, let's just go return to Israel and create a state by ourselves, right? And we'll get into all of that as this class developed. So this is one half of Jewish modernity, right? This is the religion pushed to its utmost extreme theory, right? The theory of Gershom Shalom. I want to give the other theory, and then we'll take a minute to discuss a little bit. The other theory comes from almost the complete flip side, right? If we could think of Shabtai Tzvi as religion pushed to its radical extreme. In other words, Shabtai Tzvi was clearly religious. He was messianic. There were even ideas from some of his disciples later on. He started to identify himself as quasi-divine. So Shabtai Tzvi is the nth most degree of religion pushed to its most extreme. We can say on the flip side of the coin, a man named Baruch Spinoza, who in many ways is a very interesting parallel to Shabtai Tzvi. One, they are living almost at the exact same time. We don't know if they ever corresponded, so that is a question that historians still debate. They both had much of their roots in the Sephardic converso tradition. Baruch Spinoza, of course, his family ended up in Amsterdam after getting kicked out of the Spanish-Portugal area, as did many Jews. And Baruch Spinoza early on, like every single Jew in the medieval period, was born in a traditional Jewish community, went to traditional Jewish school, and was expected to be a traditional young Jewish man. And Baruch Spinoza levies in one of his first magnum opuses a break with tradition that, again, scholars really start off as an inflection point here, not just for Judaism, here oftentimes for modernity in general. What does Baruch Spinoza do? He writes this massive tract where he deals with commentary on the Bible, he deals with Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, and he deals with new, burgeoning, nascent academic theories as to the origin of the Torah and the origin of Judaism. And at the end of his long treatise about theology and politics and religion and Judaism and the Torah, he ends up concluding that he rejects the divine authorship of the Torah, right? He puts forth the theory that will later on be developed throughout the 17 and 1800s, that the Torah cannot possibly be the work of a single God giving a people the Torah on Mount Sinai. The Torah must be a composite document that is human-made, that contains all of the errors that you would expect from any time you have a couple people working together in a large book project. This is Spinoza's theory. And with this, he undermines the idea of a personal God, right? We can say a lot about the philosophy of the Zohar or the philosophy of Maimonides, but at the end of the day, all medieval Jewish thinkers at the end of the day, kept this idea of a personal God. Yes, the God of Maimonides is very different than the God of the Zohar, which is very different than the God of Judah Halevi, right? We've done classes on that as well. But they all kept this idea where at the end of the day, we could speak about humans connecting with God, albeit in a diverse range of ways. Spinoza puts forth that there's no such thing as a personal God, and even to speak about God sort of doesn't really make sense because perhaps the universe is just God at the same time, right? Oftentimes people hold up Spinoza as a pantheist, right? It's not that everything is just material, but God and nature, they're really of the same substance. And of course, through this criticism of both the Torah and a personal God, Spinoza levies this critique against both rabbinic authority and Jewish law, and instead develops a theory of morality that is still used today in schools of moral thought, and focuses on this idea of universal morality. This is going to be the great secular challenge of the 17 and 1800s to Judaism. We're going to talk all about this next week, so I'm just going to bracket this by saying one of the big challenges that Spinoza initially levies against the Jewish community, and then later on philosophers in the German tradition are going to continue to pile on to the Jewish community, is they're going to say, hey, listen, if there is such thing as morality and ethics, which they all said there is, right? So yes, there is a world of morality. That has to both be universal and objective. In other words, if there is objective moral truth, that needs to be applied across the board. It doesn't make sense to have objective truths that are applied particularistically. And so I'll give you an example, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on 2 slides. But if I say that stealing is wrong, right? If we were to all agree with that moral precept, it's wrong whether or not I steal from Shirley, and it's wrong whether or not I steal from James, right? I think we can all agree there. But if I were to say, well, hey, I think that eating pork is wrong, but I only think eating pork is wrong for Shirley, not for my friend Dave, who's not Jewish, right? For Spinoza, that makes no sense. For Spinoza, either something is universally applicable or it's not. This will be later added to by thinkers like Immanuel Kant. We'll talk about that in a few slides. But Spinoza levies this critique against the Jewish community in this magnum opus, and he's disseminating these ideas. Now, of course, the sad part about Spinoza's life is that because he was one of the advents of modernity in general, he had no community. And so as Spinoza is starting to move to secularize Jewish identity, and Spinoza we can basically talk about as the first secular Jew, right? He was still Jewish because he never officially converted to a different religious tradition, and he wasn't accepted by people outside the Jewish community. He did open the door to being Jewish outside of faith and practice, but he was excommunicated in his 20s for speaking these ideas, right? Just to see, the advent of modernity where 150 years later, this would be commonplace for the Jewish community. In the 1800s, it would almost be the norm if you were to bump into a Jew in France or a Jew in Germany and they were to have the same views of Spinoza. But for the 1600s, for its time, this was a radical set of formulation that the Jewish community still had no room for. And again, we can speak, there's a lot more nuance that can go into the slide. But taking both the Shabtai Tzvi and Spinoza together, the 1600s, this tumultuous time, we can speak of this general decline of rabbinic authority. And one other way to think of this, and there's a lot of different angles that historians try to tackle. One, we can talk about this, right, the same way one would talk about, say, the Protestant Reformation, right? What's the common story that historians give of the Protestant Reformation? For hundreds of years, there was a hierarchy in the church, and only people at the top of the hierarchy were allowed to do certain things and read certain materials. And this was all well and good when access to materials was very bleak. But all of a sudden, once everybody can have a copy of the Bible in their living room, your average person started reading the Bible and started saying, hey, wait a minute, I have another interpretation, and that interpretation seems to go against the church, right? That's the common historic story of the Protestant Reformation. So one historical theory is that Shabtai Tzvi and Baruch Spinoza are essentially happening because of these same forces, because Jews started reading literature on secularization, on radicalism, on revolution, on messianism, and showing up to synagogue every week and your rabbi to say, You just have to keep waiting for the Messiah. You just have to keep practicing all the mitzvot. You just have to keep on learning Talmud. When all around you things were changing, except for the rabbis, people started to look around and say, well, what if I want something new, right? What if I don't think that the rabbis know everything? This eventually, and this is going to be next class with Moses Mendelssohn, leads to what we call the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. And the other interesting thing, just to throw in there, and then we'll take a minute for some questions, and then we'll start to get into a little bit of the history. At the same time, the reason why modern Jewish thought is so interesting, and I'll make the pitch for why you should come back for the next 7 or 8 weeks, is because Jews are dealing with two things in tandem, right? We can talk about the Enlightenment, say, in Europe. If this was, if none of us were Jewish or cared about Judaism, we can make this entire 8-week session about how did religious communities deal with the challenges of Enlightenment. So what happens when we learn that the earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa? What happens when we learn about the fact that the universe is billions of years old, evolution, biblical criticism, right? We could go down that list. But for Jews entering modernity, this is only half the story. The other half of the story is at the exact same time that all these intellectual revolutions were happening, political revolutions were happening side by side. And one by one, countries starting in Western Europe were undergoing political revolutions where all of a sudden they were beginning to look at Jews and they were to ask, the most blunt way possible, what and who are you guys? You guys have been kept in the corner of our cities for hundreds of years. We don't actually know who and what Jews are. Should we grant you equality? Are you loyal French citizens? Are you a state within a state? Do you guys all just want to be in Israel anyway? Are you going to have dual loyalty? Are you a religion? Are you a nationality? Are you an ethnicity? Right? All these questions that I think are still the most interesting questions to ask about Judaism. This was happening in tandem. And so to be a Jewish thinker in modernity, right? 1700s, 1800s, and I would argue even in 2025, every time you are commenting on Judaism, Jewish history, right? Even, a sermon on the weekly Parsha, you're dealing with two realities at the same time. The world of religion and ethics and morals and, holy texts and everything that you would hope to get in synagogue. And we're also dealing with sociology, politics, nationalism, right? So much so that in the mind of the Jew today in 2025, we don't even think of those two things as separate, right? I mean, if somebody asked me to divide my job into, well, the times I talk about the religious aspects of Judaism and the time I talk about the social and political aspects of Judaism, say with Hillel on campus, it's impossible. Every conversation is sort of fluid between social, politics, religion, everything like that. That is new. That is a invention in some way of modernity, and hopefully you'll see why in a second. Okay, one more slide before some questions, just to spell it out if it wasn't increasingly clear. Before talking about the changes, let's talk about what was there in the past. In the top right, for everybody that is not going to be able to take vacations in Europe this summer, which I will include myself there, we can visit Venice vicariously through this this class. This is the Jewish ghetto of Venice here. This looks like a small area for anybody who's been to Venice. It is quite small. There were between 3,000 and 6,000 people living there at any given time in the 15, 16, and 1700s, right? Really crammed in there and packed, just like ghettos in a lot of European cities. And I'm not talking about ghettos in terms of the 1940s. I'm talking about pre-emancipation ghettos. These were areas that Jews had to live in European cities. There was oftentimes curfews, so after nightfall, Jews were not allowed to leave. If Jews wanted to get a job outside of the ghetto, they would have to apply for special permission, right? So the state, the political and social state of pre-modern Jews is, of course, one of inequality. Jews were not considered citizens by any account, so there was no real protections that the government affords, right? Everything that we would hope the government would do for us if we find ourselves in trouble. So whether that's calling 911 if we get sick and need to go to the hospital, whether that's assuming the government is going to come in and fix our roads if there's a major pothole, whether that's right, Social Security at the, for people that need it and social safety nets, Jews had none of that in modernity. Everything in the Jewish community politically happened internally, right? you needed a doctor we called the Jewish doctor that was in the ghetto, and he would come help you. You needed the roads removed, right? That would be a communal effort. There was no outside government that came in to help. You needed a social safety net. There was communal tzedakah funds that were set up. And to be an upstanding member of the Jewish community, everybody would be, right, encouraged, but really, right, it was considered a norm to donate 10% of your money to charity for people that were less fortunate, and many people donating up to 20 or 30%, according to community records, right? This is a completely different situation than the way that we think about government and rights and citizenship today. And this was the state of Jewish modernity. At the same time, who was the authority? It was the rabbis, as I said before, right? The leader of the Jewish villages, right? If we're talking about Eastern Europe, the shtetl. If we're talking about Western Europe, the ghetto. If we're talking about the Sephardic or Mizrahi world, just the areas of town that Jews had to live in, right? Everything would revolve around the rabbi, right? You had a question about whether or not your matzah was kosher for Passover, you asked the rabbi. You have a question because, let's say, I don't know, Tammy hit my car pulling out of the parking lot, or hit my horse accidentally and my horse broke its leg and now I can't travel, right? You wouldn't go to a civil court. There was no such thing as a civil court. You went to the rabbi, and the rabbi would answer based off of some mixture of Talmudic law and also just the rabbi's understanding of community dynamics, right? So everything revolved around the rabbis in terms of religious authority. And there was no such thing as this differentiation between religious and civil law. I think I misspelled the word here, but today, right, this is another invention of modernity, which we'll talk about next class, which is today we think of law as there's two types of law. There's Jewish law and there's civil law. In other words, nobody today, right, I have never been asked a question by a student on campus, I accidentally hit somebody's car, am I obligated to pay him back for it, right? I can promise you I've never been asked that question. I don't think I ever will be asked that question. But from some Jewish historical perspective, that's weird, because the Talmud spends much more time talking about that exact type of questions, right? Obviously not with cars, but with oxes and other property, than it does about even Shabbat and kosher. I mean, there's one tractate of Talmud dealing with kosher, right? Tractate Chulin, and there's about 3 to 5, depending on how you count, dealing with personal damages and liability. And so this differentiation of religious and civil law, again, this is a modern phenomenon, but in the medieval ages, they were the same thing, and everything revolved around the rabbis. The rabbis also, unlike today, at least in America, Israel's a separate story, the rabbis had enforcement ability. What does that mean? That didn't mean that the wider government would enforce the rabbis. The wider government's disposition towards the Jewish community was, as long as they don't cause trouble, and as long as their community continues to pay whatever tax we obligate their community for, they can do whatever they want. Internally in the community, because the rabbis were the authority, if you did something against the will of the rabbis, there would be these local, right, you know, we would call them almost police forces, but they weren't backed by the power of the government. They were just backed by the power of the whole community follows the rabbi. And so if you upset the rabbi, you are opening yourself up to be, mishandled, we'll use a nice word, by this police force. And so if Tammy bumps into my car and we go to the rabbi and the rabbi says that Tammy is obligated to pay me, and Tammy says, no, right, you don't have any power, right? You're not the government, right? A group of, young men would probably show up to Tammy's house and essentially force her to pay the money. And if she didn't, that would be grounds for excommunication. And so there were a lot of times when people were excommunicated, and it sounds like, again, it's easy in 2025 to criticize a punishment that was given in the 1500s, but it was one way of enforcing community norms at a time when the wider government and wider society essentially wanted nothing to do with Jews. Intellectual movements, right? This is another big piece of ancient and medieval. There were a lot of intellectual movements. So I don't want to paint the picture that it wasn't until the 16 and 1700s until Jews started to think critically about God and the world and the Torah, right? The Talmud and medieval Jewish thought is full of Jews seriously deep diving and engaging with all of these fascinating questions of God and religion and the Torah and everything there. But what was assumed in the medieval period was that all of these intellectual movements had to coexist within halachic observance. So as radical as Maimonides' formulations were, that you can't say anything positive about God, and that much of the Torah is actually a metaphor, and that you can't describe God, right? This is Maimonides' worldview in the Guide to the Perplexed. At the end of the day, Maimonides was a legalist. He wrote the Mishnah Torah, and Maimonides certainly practiced Shabbat. Maimonides certainly would never have eaten something not kosher, even if you asked him and his view seemed quite heterodox, right? This is also true from the flip side of the equation, even though the Zohar plays around with radical ideas such as maybe God is actually made up of 10 disparate parts called the Sefirot, and maybe there's even feminine and masculine parts of God that have been separated in some cosmological drama, as the Zohar puts forth. At the end of the day, how do you fix that? You practice halacha, right? So all Jewish movements in the pre-modern period assumed halachic observance, and this gets us back to what we opened with. It wasn't until Shabtai Tzvi and Spinoza, coming from both sides of the equation, where Jews started to say, what does a Judaism look like that doesn't revolve around halachic observance? We'll get to that in class 3. That's going to be the Reform movement, as well as other movements. I mentioned this a little bit before, but just to spell it out, Jews had these fully autonomous communities, right? It's hard to highlight the importance of this point. Jews essentially had their own legal autonomy, and all the wider governments cared about was taxes, but they also were not considered either citizens or even individuals. In other words, France or Italy or Germany in the year 1600, they just didn't care about the Jewish community, right? At best, the Jews were irrelevant. At worst, the Jews were a nuisance that needed to be taken care of and kicked out. But there was no such thing as individual rights or universal human rights, right? All of these ideas are 1800s, and 19th century ideas, right? The idea that me as a Jew asking in France in the year 1600 or Germany in 1700, hey, I have universal rights by dint of me being a person or a citizen of the world, so therefore I should be given equal treatment to a Christian in Paris in the year 1650. That would have sounded like I was talking a different language, right? That would not have made any sense to somebody, because they would have said, well, you're not French. You're not an individual even. You're a Jew. You're part of the Jewish community, right? So, go back there, right? There's no individual rights. There's no human rights, right? These ideas are all, right, again, they would have been 200 years ahead of their time. And so this was the situation in modern Jewish life, both on the religious and also the political and social front. I'm going to take a pause for a sec to see if there are any questions or comments or anything, and then we'll have 2 or 3 more slides to set us up for Moses Mendelssohn for next week. Go for it, Rhea.
I wanted to ask because you're talking about a period of pre-Napoleonic and post-Napoleon, and that there were not really countries in the sense that we understand countries. Italy were a lot of little city states, for instance. So what I'm wondering is that the Jewish community was a separate within a separate, if you know what I mean. And were there other communities as well that were separate within the separate? That this was not just the Jewish community, but it was this in Europe. It was the general way things were laid out pre-state. Do you know?
Yeah. So in terms of a religious minority, no, because anybody who was, there were sort of only a couple options, right? If you were pagan, that you were usually dealt with worse than the Jews. And if you were Muslim, you either were kicked out during, one of the many wars, or you were forcibly converted to Christianity as well. So yes, there wasn't, nobody had individual rights. So even if you were, a Christian peasant, it's not as if you're, feudal landlord withheld pay. It's not as if you can go to the government and say, hey, I thought all humans are equal here. So the situation also wasn't political equality for everybody else. But at different times, especially with the advent of Protestantism, right, in countries where Protestantism was a majority, Catholics sort of lived in their own like little bubbles, and and vice versa. So the answer is sort of, but the only difference being that everybody kind of understood what Catholicism and Protestantism was, right? It's not to say that everybody loved it, but one of the interesting inflection points, and you mentioned Napoleon, we'll talk about him a little bit probably in 2 weeks. With pre-Napoleon and even post-Napoleon, no one even understood who the Jews were. And so this wasn't a situation of Jews all of a sudden, post-emancipation, post-French Revolution, wandering into the mainstream and people saying, oh, Jews, they're just people who have these interesting beliefs, just like my Catholic neighbor has interesting beliefs. They looked at Jews and they didn't understand, are you a religion? Are you a nationality? Are you an ethnicity? Are you part of this other group of worldwide Jews? And so that's why this question, sort of has a double relevance, because it wasn't just a question of individual rights, although there were a lot of Jews, and this is going to be the story in 2 weeks, there were a lot of Jews whose answer to modernity was essentially to trade Jewish peoplehood for individual rights. And so this is going to be somewhat of the answer of Moses Mendelssohn, certainly the answer of many of the German reformers, where they were going to say, well, if we have to decide between individual human rights, in terms of ourselves, right, or continuing to be a part of this Jewish nation / people, we're going to choose individual rights. But this is a little bit before that question even was brought up. But yeah, it's a great question. Perfect. Okay. So let's try, we got 2 more slides here. So I think we can do it. I think we're on pace here.
Daniel?
Oh yeah, go for it, Shirley.
Spinoza was ostracized. Where did he go physically, since Jews couldn't leave the ghetto?
Sorry, there's a lot of background noise. Can you say that one more time?
Since Spinoza was ostracized and he couldn't leave the ghetto, where did he physically go? Where was he able to live?
He remained wandering around. So Amsterdam was actually a lot more liberal. So, one of the difficulties always with, teaching broad strokes of history and not a ton of time is that I'm making a lot of generalizations. The situation in Amsterdam was very different, right? I just looked it up just to make sure. But he did stay in Amsterdam, and he actually, Spinoza, unlike a lot of the other, Enlightenment thinkers who were well respected at their time. Spinoza, nobody really knew Spinoza's work until after he died. And so Spinoza was, he grinded eyeglasses and lenses and things, and he was a little bit of a physicist. I think he invented some, tools for glasses. And at the end of his life, he just sort of wandered aimlessly around Netherlands, popping into different communities. He never made a lot of money. It wasn't until the end of his life that his, moral treatise was actually published posthumously. And so his ideas reverberated a lot in the Jewish community, and he essentially set a model for later thinkers. But nobody really knew him outside of Amsterdam during his life. And so...
Because even in beginning philosophy classes, they talk about Spinoza. And they said, he's kicked out.
Yeah. He was definitely kicked out. And there were others also. I'm forgetting the guy's name, but actually there were a lot of Jews in Amsterdam. Spinoza is the most famous because he began, because he's known outside of the Jewish community. But there was another man named Uriel da Costa, who was also a Sephardic Jew who was kicked out of Spain and Portugal, ended up in Amsterdam, and was also publishing heterodoxic ideas. He was also excommunicated from his community. There is an interesting historical reason for this, without getting too much into the theory. The Jews who left Spain and Portugal, many of them, their families were conversos. And so it wasn't just that all of the Sephardic Jews had left. Some of them, their families had actually practiced Christianity for a couple of generations, and then they oscillated back to Judaism. And so they anyway had in their mind the sort of malleability of identity, or, as Sholem calls it, in terms of why he argues the Sephardic community produced somebody like Shabtai Tzvi, is that there was a difference between the external and internal practice, right? This is an idea that's foreign to Judaism, but was arguably unearthed during the Inquisition. And that's as follows. In the rabbinic tradition, in the Talmud, there's no difference, right? External is internal. In other words, the way in which rabbinic Judaism, talks about the world is our actions are mostly external, right? Think about most of the mitzvot, whether those mitzvot being something between people, right? Charity, right? Visiting people if they're sick, helping, the, wedding couple pay for, ceremony, right? Those are external, and the mitzvot are external, right? If I eat kosher or I, go to shul to pray, or I build a sukkah in my, backyard. Those are all external. And so for the rabbis, Judaism was mostly dealing with external. And the idea is that that also, coincides with internal. It wasn't until the Inquisition when all of a sudden it was, well, externally I can be Christian, but internally maybe I'll keep my Jewish identity, right? There were hundreds of thousands of Jews that essentially had that attitude where they said, internally I'm Jewish, externally I'll be Christian. And so as Sholem describes, throughout the 16 and 1700s in the Sephardic community, it wasn't really considered crazy to have these completely dualistic identities, which then leads to even later formulations, right? There was one formulation of post-emancipation Judaism, we'll maybe talk about this in 2 weeks, which said that, Jews should be a Gentile in the streets, but a Jew in their house, right? Or, some formulation of that. And this idea of differentiating, the internal, external, or public and private, that's also a feature of Jewish modernity, right? That did not exist in the medieval period because there was no reason to, right? It didn't matter in the medieval period whether or not you were walking through the street dressed as a, very obviously religious Jew or not. Everybody knew you were Jewish, right? There wasn't really, room to, evolve in society. All of a sudden, as Rhea alluded to before, after the French Revolution, there was about 100 years, and we can keep arguing, whether or not this is still true to any extent in society today. But there was a cost. There was this calculation of saying, well, I can either dress and act as a Jew, right? Wear a kippah, demand that I get, Jewish holidays off from work, not go to lunch with my coworkers if they're eating at a non-kosher restaurant. And that will keep me from entering into certain social and echelons and professional areas of society. Or I can say, well, I'm willing to trade in external Jewish practice for political and social equality. So maybe I'll do that as well. So that is a dichotomy that, again, really comes about in this time as well. Let's just do, oh yeah, go for it.
Since it's such a close-knit community, isn't it painful for Spinoza to be pushed out, and emotionally and psychologically, just, having people not believe in it?
Oh, very much. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of biographies written about him. It's debatable. I mean, just two other things about Spinoza. It's debatable whether or not, or how much he identified as a Jew towards the end of his life. There's sort of competing theories on this as to, his writings have a lot of Judaism in it. It's clear that he draws a lot from Maimonides. Recently, other scholars have argued that he draws a lot even from Kabbalah and the Zohar. So you sort of have that side of Spinoza. On the other hand, Spinoza had some, relatively not nice things to say about Jews. I think there was an article in Tablet a few years ago that said, is Spinoza responsible for modern anti-Semitism? And it also made the argument that Spinoza, in many of his views, he essentially, paved the path for this view that, sadly is still around in society, that Jews are not worthy of equality unless they prove themselves worthy to be equal with equality. And this is an idea that, again, Immanuel Kant, which is the next slide, very much picks up on. So I'm going to use this as a good excuse or segue
Rabbi,
to view. Yeah, go for it.
when you were ostracized from the Jewish community, especially like in the Netherlands at that time, a lot of it was not that you were so much kicked out, you could not do business anymore within the community. And Jews really only did business with the Jews. So if you were ostracized, you were pretty much, could not work. You were put out of business. And, a lot of them had trade connections with the markets around the world. And they just could not do business, to do business with and most Gentiles would not do business with you then either. They didn't do business with the Jews. So you were kind of like ostracized just from employment.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, employment, you can never get married because at that point, nobody in the Christian community is going to marry a Jew. But if you're Jewish and, put in cherem, no rabbi is going to officiate your wedding. So, it was really everything. Sylvia, go for it.
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody else is there and ahead of me, maybe?
I don't think so.
Mr. Tilchin, maybe? Okay. All right. Well, I'll go. And if he wants to chime in, it'll be great. I was just struck by what you said. That was it. Who was it who blamed us for anti-Semitism? Was it Spinoza?
It was Spinoza, and then Immanuel Kant very forcefully drives home that argument. We'll talk about Kant in a second.
Oh, good, because as you probably know, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs totally rejects that, very forcefully, and I think that his argument is much better than their argument, to tell you the truth. But yeah, just a comment on that.
No, I appreciate it. Yes. I guess to restate, nobody today should take the idea seriously that Jews are to blame for anti-Semitism. So I want to make sure to highlight that. But in the 17 and 1800s, the average view of both non-Jews and also a lot of Jews who were attempting to usher Jews into full equality within Europe were willing to entertain that idea. I mean, non-Jews were not just willing to entertain it, were willing to like forcefully affirm it, and Jews were willing to essentially engage with that idea. And we'll see why in a second. All right, James, go for it, and then we're gonna do one more slide. Go for it.
So all these, we'll call them influential Jews and rabbis and such, these intellectuals, they were essentially ostracized from Jewish society. And as Jews, of course, they weren't particularly well cared for by the non-Jewish society. Yet here we are today, hundreds of years later, and we've got all of these amazing writings and documentations and dissertations and so much from these guys. How did we get that when they were essentially ostracized from everything?
Are you saying how did we physically get it, or why are we still talking about Spinoza if 300 years ago there was a attempted movement to cut him off?
Well, not so much that. I know why we talk about it, because it's fascinating stuff to talk about. It's very influential, and it's important things to talk about. But how did all of this come down to us hundreds of years later when these guys were essentially thrown out of everything? I mean, these books like were in the corner of a bookstore somewhere in France and Spain or Portugal, and they just ended up coming out here. You know what I'm saying? It's like,
yeah. Okay,
so
that's why, I mean, we'll kind of take both in parallel. For Shabtai Tzvi, after Shabtai Tzvi, 40% of the world, again, and that's sort of a moderate estimate, believe that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, and were willing to follow him and everything like that. This created a breaking point where many of the rabbis also went along with Shabtai Tzvi, right? It's not as if Shabtai Tzvi was, just a populist movement. You had many of the biggest rabbis in the world saying, now the Messiah has come, right? This guy's great, everything like that. And when that didn't materialize, the lack of faith in rabbinic structure, even if we actually don't have any writings from Shabtai Tzvi, he didn't write much. We have a lot from Nathan of Gaza and from Abraham Cardozo, right, a later follower of Shabtai Tzvi, and and the movement continued, right? There was Jacob Frank in Poland in the 1700s and everything there, and so, but it was more the idea for Shabtai Tzvi that sort of broke something in Judaism, right? Like no longer could or would your average Jew blindly trust in everything the rabbi said, right? I know it seems like a radical thing, right? But it really was. If you were in the medieval period and most communities and the rabbi said something, if you would just believe them, whether or not that was political or philosophical or legal or theological. All of a sudden now in the 1600s, the rabbis have gotten things wrong. And so all of a sudden there was this huge turn for Spinoza as well. I mean, after Spinoza dies, a lot of his work is published posthumously, and this has a major effect in a whole range of thinkers. And so over the next 100 years, all great Enlightenment thinkers post Spinoza are dealing with Spinoza in some way. And that's certainly true with, even thinkers like Immanuel Kant, who again, sort of take Spinoza's universalism argument to the extreme. I do see the time, and so I want to just do one more slide because I want us to set up for Moses Mendelssohn next week, who's really the first great Jewish. The reason why I'm not including Spinoza as a Jewish thinker of modernity is because Spinoza never wanted to be a Jewish thinker, right? In other words, Spinoza was specifically writing, and this is why there's been some later people that have essentially, said that blamed Spinoza for some anti-Semitism. Is Spinoza essentially, right? Spinoza is no longer writing as a Jew. He explicitly says, "I'm writing as sort of a citizen of the world," even if it's clear that he has a Jewish background as well. So let's do a tiny bit of Immanuel Kant here, and then we'll set us up for next week. Okay. So next week we'll talk about a lot of the political side of this. But Immanuel Kant, who, just for a little bit of a background, he is a German Enlightenment philosopher in the 18th century. So this is, again, still before the French Revolution, still before, Jews would have been given political equality in any country. But the question was arising, right? The story of the 1700s in Western Europe was a story of waning power of religion and increased power of Enlightenment ideas of secularization and the idea of universalism. And so, in other words, by the year 1724, when Immanuel Kant was born in Germany, it would have made somewhat sense if I were walking through the streets of Berlin or Paris and I said, as an individual, I have human rights, right? That idea would not have made any sense in the year 1500 in Paris or Berlin. But by the mid 1700s, these ideas of universalism had already started to creep up, but they were not yet applied to Jews. And Immanuel Kant's, his entire milieu revolves around, right? There's a reason why he is the quintessential Enlightenment thinker, right? In his essay, What is Enlightenment? He says, Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. In other words, for Immanuel Kant, the pinnacle of enlightenment comes when you as an individual can formulate ideas that you know to be true. The pinnacle of the opposite of enlightenment is if you require somebody else to tell you what is good or bad. What is the quintessential essence of, at least for Immanuel Kant, a system where somebody else is telling you what is good or bad? That is strict religion, right? And so for Immanuel Kant, right, he has specific ire for religion in general, right? But specifically Judaism, as we'll see in a minute, because of this idea. Immanuel Kant's probably best known for what is known as the categorical imperative. Categorical imperative is best known as the idea of, what if everybody did that? But in other words, for Immanuel Kant, an action is only moral if you can will that it should become a universal law. So this is the exact case I said before. If I say that stealing is wrong regardless of what day of the week it is, what time it is, and who I'm stealing from, and what I'm stealing. If I say that lighting a fire is wrong, but only on Saturday and only for certain people, for Immanuel Kant, that breaks the logical rules of moral reasoning. Because if lighting a fire on Saturday for somebody who's Jewish is wrong, then lighting a fire should always be wrong and should be wrong every day of the week. If lighting a fire is not wrong for somebody who, say, is not Jewish on a Saturday, then there's no rational reason why that thing could be wrong for Jews at the same time. And so for Immanuel Kant, these two ideas came together in a full-on assault on Judaism. There are sort of a myriad of essays that Immanuel Kant writes about Jews in particular. Here's a quote from one from his theory of what good religion should be, right? He wrote an essay called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. It is his brand of very rationalist Protestantism. And here's what he writes about Judaism. He says, the Jewish faith as originally established was only a collection of merely statutory laws supporting a political state. For whatever moral additions were appended to it, whether originally or only later, do not in any way belong to Judaism as such. So Immanuel Kant is making two claims about Judaism that are going to create the next 150 years of Jews attempting to argue against Immanuel Kant. The two claims are Judaism is just a bunch of set of statutory laws. In other words, Judaism is reduced to being a bunch of ritual acts that don't make any sense. And even if at times there is morality to be found in Judaism, it's sort of a later accident. But the essence of Judaism is not morality. The essence of Judaism is laws for an outdated political state. In other words, let me give you an example. Imagine if, you know, imagine if somebody told you in 300 years from now, the state of California or the United States of America would no longer exist, right? Let's just take that as a premise. And we all lived, I don't know, on the moon, right? So we're all living in the moon and there's no such thing as the United States of America. But say a small group of people that were just really invested in keeping the memory of the United States of America ongoing brought copies of legal books and the Constitution and court cases, and we had this little colony on the moon where we were trying to act according to all the laws of California. Now, from some perspective, this would make little sense because California, say, is a major exporter of produce, right? You drive through Central California, it's all farmland. A lot of fruit in the country comes from California. So there's books and legal treaties and court cases about farmers and, all the things you would expect. There's obviously not going to be a lot of produce farming on the moon, at least, not in 300 years. And so from some perspective, it would be weird if that colony on the moon is worried about, different produce laws in California. Now, for Immanuel Kant, this is exactly what Jews are doing, right? For Immanuel Kant, Jewish law, aka the Bible, right, the Mosaic law, the Torah, was a set of laws that dealt with a political kingdom, right, kingdom of David and Judea, way back in the BCs. And these laws might have made sense in its time, right? You read through the Torah, lots of laws about agriculture, lots of laws about priests and Levites, lots of laws about kings. And he says, well, essentially Judaism now is sort of just this vague collection of, outdated laws from a state that no longer is around. And so Immanuel Kant takes this to imply that any Jew who is still engaged in Judaism or the practice of Jewish community is essentially not fit for enlightenment, right? He uses in this first essay, what is enlightenment? Immature. And he's going to levy this critique on the Jewish community. He's going to say the Jewish community is intellectually immature. He writes in another essay, as long as Jews are Jews and circumcised, they will never become more useful than harmful in civil society. Now they are vampires in society, right? What Immanuel Kant is saying, right, put aside the, obvious problematic anti-Semitic undertones for a second, and let's crystallize this argument because this argument is going to go through two major evolutions over the next 100 years of Jewish thought. And I'll be overly simple for a second, and then over the next couple of weeks, we're going to deep dive more into this. One half of Jewish thinkers are going to essentially say to Immanuel Kant, you are right. We need to shift Judaism accordingly. That's going to be one response to Kant. The other is going to say Kant is completely wrong. Kant completely misses the point of Judaism. That's going to be the other approach. There's going to be later approaches once we get into the late 1800s, but in terms of early 1800s reaction to Kant, those are going to be the two major Jewish responses. But Kant is essentially saying that Jews are not fit for civil society. Jews are not fit for political equality. Jews are not fit to be a part of these great states of nationalism, be it Germany or France or Italy or, whatever country we might talk about, because, again, they are practicing a collection of merely statutory laws, right, that are completely, right, tangential to everything we're doing here. In other words, and this is the last thing that I'll say, and then we will see Mendelssohn's response next week, Kant is looking around and he's saying, okay, this is obviously before emancipation, right? This is before Jews had any equality in Germany, but the question came up, right? During the advent of German nationalism, the question was, who should be considered a German citizen, right? You have a state, that state gives certain protections, that state has certain universal moral laws that it should apply to all citizens living within a state, right? Pretty basic things. Who should get that? Should it be everybody living here, or do you have to deserve it? And Immanuel Kant is saying, one, you have to deserve it, right? You don't get to be protected and you don't get to be German just because you were born in Germany and spent your whole life living in Germany and speak German, right? All the things that Jews were, or Yiddish, right? Sort of an offshoot of German. Immanuel Kant is saying there is some ideal way of life, right? Some mix of Protestantism and universal rationalism that one needs to meet in order for them to be granted equality. And Jews have not done that, right? Jews are still, again, keeping their statutory particularistic law. They don't deserve any equality, right? So this is how the Enlightenment started off for Jews. And Immanuel Kant, again, the most famous thinker, certainly in Germany during the Enlightenment, one can make an argument, the most famous Enlightenment thinker, he starts to spread these ideas. Now, the Jewish community in Germany, this will actually be the last thing I say. I know I say that a lot. The Jewish community in Germany at this point was the most social, political, and philosophically engaged Jewish community in the world in the 1700s. And we'll see this with Moses Mendelssohn next week. It was a major center of Jewish learning, and it was a major center of Jewish intellectualism, right, on the philosophic level. And so this wasn't Immanuel Kant necessarily saying this to a group of Hasidic Jews that were still in the shtetl somewhere in, Poland or Hungary or Ukraine. This is him saying this to a group of Jews in Germany that are, again, going through a lot of these same social and political and religious forces as the Protestant community at the same time. And so cliffhanger for next week, how does Mendelssohn respond? Happy to hang out for any questions. Marsha, go for it.
Well, I mean, actually, my question was just on the heels of what you just said was, what Jews did he know? In the same, did he? And it sounds like he was already dealing with Jews who were already dancing at two weddings, who were already intellectuals, who were still traditional, yes, but much more sophisticated than the people picking potatoes in Siberia or Belarus. You know what I'm saying? He was dealing with the intelligentsia and still berating them for their practices. Is that correct?
Yes, although we don't know if Kant ever met any Jews. There's sort of a funny, there was a funny article, well, not funny, I mean, sad, but, funny in some sense of, famous anti-Semites who had never met any Jews, or, famous anti-Semitic works. So, the other one, that we could talk about, right? There's a lot of motifs of anti-Semitism in Chaucer and Shakespeare, right? But Jews had been kicked out of England for, 200 years before, right? It's doubtful whether or not Chaucer ever met a Jew, right? Yet he still has anti-Semitic stereotypes. So we don't know. Immanuel Kant's often spoken about in that. He might have met, Jewish merchants. He certainly never had any correspondence with Moses Mendelssohn. Most historians think Mendelssohn knew of Kant, but Kant didn't know of Mendelssohn. I think Mendelssohn's a couple years. He was born, maybe 10 years after Kant, and then ended up dying a little bit earlier as well. But we don't know what, if he actually knew any Jews.
Well, I just want to say, I hope everybody here feels as satisfied as I do with this incredible introduction to this class. Daniel, excellent job. This will be up on our YouTube channel with the slides. Daniel, please send Madalena the slides so that she can attach it to the recording, just so if people, although I guess we don't really need it, because if you're watching the recording, you can see the slides. Very good, Marcia. I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. If you have not yet formally registered for this class, please do so. I put the link in the chat. We'll see you next week. Thank you, everybody.
Amazing. Well, thank you, everybody. And I'll also put a video if anybody's curious about more Shabtai Tzvi. He's become, one of my, pet historic interests. And so here's I had a conversation with one of the experts on him a couple of months ago. But I'm excited to see everybody next Monday at 9:30. Thank you, Marsha.
Thank you.